Next, I want to talk about population change. And as we noted earlier, that since the gold rush, there's been a high influx of people into California. So most of our population change initially was because of migration. So migration, California has had more migrants than many other parts of the country. A little bit on terminology. So migrants are people who move from one place to the other, and you can describe them one of two ways. And each one depends on your perspective, that immigrants move to a place. So in California, we've had many immigrants, people who came to California. Emigrants with an E kind of sounds similar, but it means people who leave the place. They move from a place. So migrants can be either one. It depends on your perspective. So if you talk about people moving to California from the Midwest during the Dust Bowl, they were immigrants to California, but they were emigrants from the Midwest. It just depends on your perspective. We can also look at why people migrate, and we can lump migrants into a couple of different categories. Selective immigrants are responding to pull factors. They're attracted to a place, like getting a better job. So if you're an engineer, say overseas, and you move to Silicon Valley because engineering jobs pay more, that would be a good example of a pull factor. And then you have non-selective migrants, and they respond to push factors. They are often what we call refugees, people who are being pushed out because of starvation, violence, and that sort of thing. And sometimes it's a gray area. If you look at during the Dust Bowl, or migrations of people who are, suffering crop failures and violence in Central America, partially they're responding to both. That in some sense, they're looking for better opportunities in California, but oftentimes it's because they've been pushed out because of environmental disasters or because of violence. So if we look at the number of immigrants in California, about 15% respond to employment preferences, about 5% are refugees, but then many of them are also family sponsored and are responding to various, we don't know the breakout of that. And a lot of it has to do with place utility, how satisfied you are with where you live. If your conditions are good, you have less reason to leave. And when it comes to family-sponsored migration, that's what we call chain migration. That's where a family or an individual moves to a place, and they sort of set the conditions to bring other members of their family along later on. We can also look at demography. Demography is about the study of populations over time. We can look at births, deaths, and so on. Demography also has to do with the types of population, ethnic breakdowns, that sort of thing. But some basics on demography, there's something called the demographic equation, which gives you an idea of how populations grow. And you need to look at two things. You need to look at births and deaths. So the natural change is if you have more people born than are dying, then you're going to have population growth. But you also need to consider migration as well, because you can also have in-migration and out-migration. So in this figure here, births are filling up the tub and deaths are emptying it. And you also have in-migration filling the tub and out-migration emptying it. So you have inputs and outputs. And that can determine your population growth level. These are what are called age-structured diagrams, or sometimes they're called population pyramids because sometimes they're pyramid-shaped. And these are showing changes in California over time. Let's take a little closer look at that. And one thing about them is that they are structured where males are on one side and females are on the other. Typically, they look like this. This is California in the 1970s, where you have a fairly even distribution. This is in 1850 during the gold rush, where you had a lot of dudes, a lot more male population, lower female population. And then by 1970, you had more of an even shape. This wider part here, these are baby boomers. So the width of the graph shows you where you have the greatest population. By 2000, it's a little bit thinner. You have those baby boomers who were here are now kind of up the chart a little bit. And by 2010, they're up a bit further, going towards retirement age. By the way, the baby boomers are the generation that were born after World War II, when you had a baby boom. Okay, so back to the demographic equation. If you look at change over time in California, that you have both natural increases and you also have changes in immigration patterns. So that if you look at the age structure diagrams, that you have times with higher migration and times with lower migration. And so you have, higher levels of migrants during, that are, that because of when we had higher migration. And then that's also combined with the natural population, the births versus death. And together the migration and natural change make up the population distribution in California. So in numbers, the population, if you want to know the population has changed, you have to consider both births minus deaths, plus that's the natural population change, plus net migration, which is incoming migrants minus outgoing migrants. And that is how the population changes over time in California. Now, one thing to mention too is something called the demographic transition model. And this isn't specific to California, but something that is sort of a model of what happened in Europe since the Industrial Revolution. And it's a way of looking at how populations change in industrialized parts of the world. So before the Industrial Revolution, you had a high birth rate and a high death rate. And as we went into the Industrial Revolution, one thing that happened early on was a drop in the death rate. But the birth rate remained constant. And during that time, you had an upswing in population, heavy population increase. Then later on, what happened is that the birth rate caught up. The birth rate starts to drop. People are having less kids. If you think about how many kids people tend to have today versus 20 years ago versus 20 years before that, as the number of children decrease, then that bends the curve of the population. And nowadays, people are having so few kids, though, that there is almost a decrease of population in much of the industrialized world. And many countries like the United States, Europe, and Japan have concerns about a shrinking or non-growing population. And so migrants help to fill in that gap. One thing about migrants is that they tend to be younger than the average age of the population. So in places like Europe, that migration helps to maintain the population over time. And that's true of California as well. Yeah, where do people come from? We can look at, we have both international migration. The top country that sends migrants to California is Mexico, which makes geographic sense because Mexico borders California. After that, the Philippines, China, and India are the other top three. On top of migration from other countries, we have migration also from other states. And we had an influx. It was positive up to the 1990s, but more recently, that's begun to change. That since about 2005, we've had more people leaving California than coming in, at least leaving to other parts of the United States. Some factors you can probably guess: housing prices, that it's getting expensive to live in California relative to some other parts of the country. So oftentimes people will find other job opportunities and lower cost of living in other parts of the country. Some of this is people who retire in other places and sell their house and live better somewhere else. If you look at how much legal or regular migration by county, Los Angeles has the highest amount of migration, Bay Area behind that, and then through the Central Valley. But most of the migration is concentrated in Los Angeles and its neighboring counties, and then secondarily in the Bay Area.